Welcome to another episode, Spotlight Murders by Skoob. I'm your host, Kieran Caldwell, and today we're diving deep into one of punk rock's most enduring mysteries, the death of Johnny Thunders. Picture this, April 23rd, 1991, New Orleans, Louisiana. A hotel housekeeper uses her passkey to enter room 37 at the St. Peter Guest House, and what she discovers will haunt the music world for decades to come. Before we unravel the mystery of that fateful night in New Orleans, we need to understand who Johnny Thunders really was. Born John Anthony Genzile Jr. On July 15th, 1952, in Queens, New York, Johnny grew up in the kind of tough, working-class neighborhood that breeds either fighters or dreamers. In his case, it bred both. Raised mainly by his mother and older sister after his father abandoned the family, young Johnny found solace in music. It was louder than his problems, more honest than his circumstances, and infinitely more promising than anything else his environment offered. As a teenager, he picked up a guitar and never really put it down again. At first, he called himself Johnny Volume, and if you've ever heard his playing, you'll understand why. That name captured everything about his approach to music: big, rough, unapologetic, and impossible to ignore. He played in school bands and small local groups, but his real destiny began when he connected with Arthur Killer Kane and Billy Mersha. Together, they would change their band's name to the New York Dolls in 1971, and Johnny Volume would transform into Johnny Thunders. The Dolls were unlike anything the music world had seen. They mixed screaming guitars with raucous energy, topped off with flamboyant clothes and makeup that challenged every convention of what rock stars were supposed to look like. They were messy, they were wild, and that wasn't a flaw, it was their superpower. Their two albums, New York Dolls and Too Much Too Soon, barely sold at the time, but today they're recognized as the foundational texts of punk rock. Johnny's guitar playing wasn't technically perfect. It was something much more important. It was intuitive, filled with rhythm and raw emotion that followed no traditional rules except the ones written in his heart. Fellow musicians described his sound as having an almost supernatural sense of pace and character, even when it was falling apart at the seams. But success came with a devastating cost. In 1972, drummer Billy Mersha died, and it shattered something fundamental in Johnny and the band. Loss would become a recurring theme in Johnny's life. Not just the loss of friends, but the gradual loss of himself to the very lifestyle that fueled his creativity. After the Dolls began falling apart, Johnny and drummer Jerry Nolan formed the Heartbreakers with bassist Richard Hell and guitarist Walter Lure. If the Dolls had been raw, the Heartbreakers were molten. They took everything that made the Dolls great and distilled it into pure punk essence. Their only studio album, LAMF, released in 1977, is now considered a masterpiece of early punk rock. Songs like Too Much Junkie Business and Chinese Rocks weren't just music, they were dispatches from the front lines of a war between artistic expression and self-destruction. They captured the reckless, often tragic world the band inhabited with unflinching honesty. But Johnny's brilliance came with chaos. He could deliver a transcendent performance one night and be completely unreliable the next. Friends described him as sometimes appearing to be walking death, just trying to survive each day. His hands became so damaged from his lifestyle that doctors warned he could lose one entirely if he didn't seek treatment immediately. In 1978, Johnny struck out as a solo artist, and here's where something beautiful emerged from all that darkness. His first solo album, So Alone, became a critical success and featured what many consider his masterpiece. You Can't Put Your Arms Around a Memory. This haunting song became an anthem for anyone who's ever felt the crushing weight of loss and loneliness, which, let's face it, describes most of us at some point. The contradictions in Johnny's personality fascinated everyone who knew him. He was funny and intelligent, but also self-destructive and unreliable. One quote that has stayed with fans perfectly captures his worldview. A lot of people want to die for a lot of reasons. It's bleak, yes, but it's also honest in a way that cuts through all the romantic nonsense people attach to tragedy. By the late 1980s, Johnny's health was deteriorating rapidly. He'd been battling addiction for years, but now there were whispers of something worse: leukemia. Despite everything, he held on to a dream. He wanted to move to New Orleans to play with blues and jazz musicians, to connect with the roots of American music that had originally inspired him. On April 22, 1991, that dream seemed within reach. Johnny flew into New Orleans and checked into room 37 at the St. Peter Guest House in the French Quarter. He was 38 years old, carrying guitars, silk suits, and a substantial amount of cash from recent European shows. For the first time in months, maybe years, he seemed to have hope. What happened next would become the subject of endless speculation and debate. Johnny didn't spend that night alone in his hotel room. Instead, he dove headfirst into the legendary nightlife of the French Quarter, making fast friends with other hotel guests, specifically 2 young men named Michael and Mark Ricks. Picture this scene: a warm April night in one of America's most intoxicating cities. Johnny Thunders, punk rock legend, wandering through the neon-lit streets of the French Quarter with people he'd just met. They hit bars like Kagan's and Pat O'Brien's, sharing drinks, joints, and stories. For a few hours, Johnny seemed to capture some of that old magic: the connection, the energy, the feeling that anything was possible. Witnesses described Johnny as alternating between animated and exhausted throughout the night. Sometimes he was the charming storyteller, regaling new friends with tales from the road. Other moments, the weight of his illness and years of hard living showed clearly. The mixture of alcohol, marijuana, and the infectious energy of New Orleans created a dangerous cocktail for someone in his fragile condition. As the night wore on, the group returned to the hotel, and the party continued in room 37. Hotel staff later reported loud conversations and disturbances well into the early morning hours. Someone on another floor even complained, and the front desk tried to call Johnny's room to ask them to quiet down. He never answered. What exactly happened in those final hours remains murky. The atmosphere seemed to shift from celebration to something darker. There were later references to arguments over pills, to the presence of harder drugs, to tension that hadn't been there earlier in the evening. April 23, 1991, early afternoon. A hotel housekeeper approached room 37 when Johnny failed to answer the door or phone. What she found when she used her passkey to enter would haunt everyone involved for decades to come. Johnny Thunders was on the floor, curled in what could only be described as a pretzel-like position. Rigor mortis had set in so severely that his body was almost folded in half. The image was so disturbing that when singer Willie DeVille, who lived nearby, watched paramedics carry Johnny out in a body bag, he later admitted to making up a story about Johnny dying with a guitar in his hands just to give him some dignity. The reality was simply too awful to bear. But the position of his body wasn't the only disturbing aspect of the scene. The room was completely ransacked. It looked like a struggle had taken place, or like someone had desperately searched for something. Personal items were scattered everywhere, and many of Johnny's belongings were missing, including his passport and a significant amount of cash he'd been carrying from his European tour dates. The initial response from authorities was swift and, many would argue, superficial. The New Orleans police took one look at the scene, saw a known drug user, and essentially decided it was just another overdose. Case closed. The coroner's investigator, John Galliano, told the press that tests showed substantial amounts of cocaine and methadone in Johnny's system, and the Associated Press reported these as the likely cause of death. But this is where the story gets complicated. When the complete autopsy and toxicology reports were finished weeks later, they painted a very different picture. The drug levels found in Johnny's system were actually quite low, not nearly enough to constitute a clearly fatal overdose. So if it wasn't simply drugs that killed him, what was it? The detailed autopsy revealed a body ravaged by disease. advanced leukemia, malignant lymphoma affecting his lymph nodes, spleen, lungs, and liver, pulmonary edema, fluid in his lungs indicating a weakened heart, severe liver damage from years of substance abuse. This wasn't just a drug overdose. This was a man whose body was failing from multiple catastrophic health issues. Walter Lure, his bandmate from the Heartbreakers, once grimly observed that between all the marks and deterioration, Johnny looked like a pizza. His immune system was essentially gone. His body was shutting down. The question became, did he die from his illnesses, from the drugs, from some combination of both, or from something else entirely? The autopsy report for Johnny Thunders reads like a medical textbook of everything that can go wrong with the human body. When Dr. Frank Minyard, the New Orleans coroner, and his team examined Johnny's remains, they uncovered a catalog of health disasters that painted a picture of a man who had been dying for months, maybe years. The leukemia alone was a death sentence. Advanced blood cancer had been eating away at Johnny's immune system, leaving him vulnerable to infections and complications that a healthy person would easily survive. But that was just the beginning. The lymphoma had spread throughout his body, attacking his organs with ruthless efficiency. His liver showed extensive damage consistent with years of alcohol and drug abuse. His lungs contained fluid, pulmonary edema, indicating his heart was struggling to function properly. His cardiovascular system was compromised. In medical terms, Johnny Thunders was a walking miracle, surviving day to day on willpower and whatever strength his decimated body could muster. Here's what makes the toxicology results so puzzling. Given the state of his body, even small amounts of drugs could have been catastrophic. The cocaine and methadone found in his system might not have been enough to kill a healthy person, but for someone in Johnny's condition, they could have been the final straw that broke his body's ability to function. But the medical findings also opened up other possibilities. Some experts who reviewed the case later suggested that his death could have been entirely natural, the inevitable result of advanced cancer and organ failure. Others pointed out that his compromised immune system would have made him extremely vulnerable to any additional stress, whether from drugs, physical trauma, or even severe emotional distress. The autopsy also noted evidence of immunosuppression and risks related to infections, adding another layer to the medical mystery. In the early 1990s, certain tests that might be routine today weren't always conducted, leaving gaps in the medical picture that fuel speculation even now. Dr. Minyard himself seemed uncertain about the exact cause of death. While the official reports cited the drug combination, the actual findings suggested a much more complex medical situation. This ambiguity would prove crucial to the conspiracy theories that followed. Not everyone accepted the official story of accidental overdose. Within days of Johnny's death, a much darker theory began circulating through the punk rock underground, and it centered on a phone call that D.D. Ramone claimed to have received the day after Johnny died. According to D.D.'s autobiography, Lobotomy: Surviving the Ramones, Johnny's guitarist Stevie Klassen called him with a chilling account. They told me that Johnny had gotten mixed up with some bastards who ripped him off for his methadone supply. They had given him LSD and then murdered him. This version of events paints a picture of Johnny as the victim of people who saw him as an easy target. He was carrying a large supply of methadone from England, legally prescribed to help him stay off harder drugs. In the drug culture of New Orleans, that supply would have had significant street value. The theory goes like this. Johnny met people that night who seemed friendly but had ulterior motives. They gained his trust, got him back to his hotel room, and then either forced him to give them his drugs or simply took them. To cover their tracks or to incapacitate him, they gave him LSD, a drug Johnny reportedly hated and avoided. For someone in Johnny's weakened physical condition, with advanced leukemia and a compromised immune system, a forced LSD trip could have been catastrophic. The stress alone might have been enough to trigger organ failure. Add in the trauma of being robbed and potentially assaulted, and you have a recipe for death that goes far beyond simple overdose. The missing belongings support this theory. Johnny's passport, cash, and various personal items were gone when his body was found. But here's where it gets strange. His guitars were still there, along with some money. If this was a simple robbery, why leave behind items that had both monetary and sentimental value? Johnny's sister, Marianne Bracken, became one of the strongest advocates for the murder theory. She claimed that when she tried to access the police files, she found them incomplete or missing entirely. She believed the New Orleans police had written her brother off as just another junkie and hadn't bothered to conduct a proper investigation. The physical evidence seemed to support foul play. The ransacked room, Johnny's body found underneath a coffee table in that twisted position, the missing items, it all suggested something more violent than a peaceful overdose. Manager Mick Webster, who arrived in New Orleans shortly after Johnny's death, described the hotel room as looking like a crime scene that had been ignored by authorities who couldn't be bothered to care about another dead rock star. What makes the Johnny Thunders case so enduringly mysterious isn't just what happened that night, but what didn't happen afterward. The investigation, if you can call it that, was cursory at best. The New Orleans police seemed to take one look at Johnny's reputation and decide his death wasn't worth their time. This attitude infuriated everyone who cared about Johnny. His manager, Mick Webster, flew to New Orleans immediately after the death and was appalled by what he found. Not only was the hotel room in shambles, but the police seemed completely uninterested in treating it as anything other than a routine drug death. Webster tried to push for a more thorough investigation, but was met with bureaucratic indifference. The missing police files became a particularly sore point for Johnny's family. When his sister Marianne tried to obtain complete records of the investigation, she was told that portions of the file were missing or had never been properly compiled. This fed suspicions that either there was deliberate cover-up or such negligent police work that crucial evidence had been lost. Some people theorized that the cover-up wasn't necessarily about Johnny specifically, but about protecting New Orleans' tourism industry. The French Quarter depends on its reputation as a place where visitors can safely indulge in vice and debauchery. A high-profile murder case involving a rock star might have been seen as bad for business, especially if it suggested that tourists were being targeted by local criminals. Others pointed to the general attitude toward drug users in law enforcement at the time. Johnny was seen as someone who had brought his problems on himself, making him an unsympathetic victim in the eyes of authorities. The prevailing attitude seemed to be that if a known drug user died in circumstances involving drugs, case closed, no need to look deeper. The coroner's office contributed to the confusion with their contradictory statements. The initial press release suggesting substantial drug amounts was later contradicted by the actual toxicology results. But by then, the narrative of simple overdose was already established in the media and public consciousness. Not every alternative theory involves murder. Some people who knew Johnny well believe his death was the inevitable result of his deteriorating health, possibly accelerated by well-meaning but ultimately fatal decisions. One theory suggests that Johnny, knowing he was dying from leukemia, may have intentionally taken substances as a form of self-medication or even assisted suicide. He'd been open about his struggles and had made statements that could be interpreted as indicating he knew his time was limited. His quote about people wanting to die for a lot of reasons takes on different meaning in this context. Another possibility is accidental poisoning or a drug interaction that nobody involved understood at the time. Johnny was taking methadone to manage his addiction, but if he also consumed alcohol and other substances with people who didn't know his medical history, the combination could have been fatal even in small doses. His compromised immune system and organ function meant that drug interactions that might only make a healthy person sick could kill him. Some friends theorized that Johnny might have been given substances without his knowledge, not necessarily with murderous intent, but through recklessness or ignorance. If someone spiked his drinks or shared drugs without telling him what they were, his body's inability to process even moderate amounts could have triggered organ failure. The stress theory shouldn't be discounted either. Johnny's autopsy showed a body that was hanging on by a thread. The excitement of being in New Orleans, staying up all night partying, the emotional highs and lows of socializing with strangers. Any of these could have been enough to push his failing cardiovascular system past its breaking point. There's also the possibility that Johnny experienced some kind of seizure or medical emergency in the hotel room, and, in his disoriented state, caused the damage that made the room look ransacked. The missing items could have been taken by opportunistic individuals who found him dying or already dead, rather than being the cause of his death. More than 30 years after Johnny Thunder's death, we're no closer to definitive answers than we were in 1991. The official cause remains drug-related, but the circumstances surrounding his death continue to generate debate, speculation, and investigation by fans, journalists, and amateur detectives. Part of what keeps the mystery alive is the perfect storm of factors that surrounded Johnny's death. He was sick enough to die naturally, troubled enough to die accidentally, and vulnerable enough to be murdered. All three scenarios remain plausible given the evidence we have. The location adds to the mystique. New Orleans has always been a city where the line between life and death seems thinner than elsewhere. It's a place where people go to lose themselves, to transform, or to disappear entirely. For someone like Johnny, who had spent his entire adult life walking that line, it seems almost inevitable that his story would end there. Room 37 at what's now called the Inn on St. Peter has become an unofficial shrine for Johnny Thunder's fans. People request that specific room, hoping to connect with whatever energy remains from that tragic night. The hotel staff are used to questions about what happened there, and the room has taken on an almost mythical quality in punk rock lore. The mystery has also been kept alive by the people who loved Johnny and refused to let his story be dismissed as just another rock star overdose. They continue to push for answers, to question the official narrative, and to investigate new leads as they emerge. Documentary filmmakers, biographers, and journalists periodically revisit the case, each hoping to be the one who finally solves it. But perhaps the mystery serves a purpose beyond simple curiosity. Johnny Thunders represented something pure and uncompromising in rock and roll, a refusal to sanitize or commercialize his art, even when it cost him everything. The uncertainty around his death preserves that rebellious spirit, preventing his story from being neatly categorized and filed away. Whatever killed Johnny Thunders that night in New Orleans, it couldn't kill his influence on music. His approach to rock and roll, raw, emotional, technically imperfect but spiritually pure, continues to inspire musicians around the world. He proved that you don't need to be the greatest technical player to make an impact. Sometimes, attitude, volume, and reverb are enough. His solo work, particularly You Can't Put Your Arms Around a Memory, has become more poignant with time. The song captures something universal about loss and loneliness that resonates with anyone who's ever felt like an outsider. In many ways, it serves as Johnny's own epitaph, a haunting meditation on the things we can't hold on to and the memories that won't let us go. The influence of the New York Dolls and the Heartbreakers can be heard in countless punk, alternative, and rock bands that followed. Johnny's guitar style, all treble and attitude, became a template for punk rock that's still being followed today. His willingness to wear his damage on the outside gave permission to generations of musicians to be vulnerable and honest in their art. But Johnny's legacy isn't just musical. His life and death have become a cautionary tale about the cost of artistic authenticity in a world that often demands compromise. He never sold out, never cleaned up his act for mainstream acceptance, and never pretended to be anything other than what he was. That integrity came with a price, but it also ensured that his art remained pure. The mystery surrounding his death has, in a strange way, become part of that legacy. It prevents Johnny from being reduced to simple narratives about addiction or self-destruction. Instead, it preserves the complexity that made him such a compelling figure. The contradictions, the questions, the refusal to be easily categorized. So what really happened in room 37 at the St. Peter Guest House on April 23, 1991? Was Johnny Thunders' death the inevitable cost of a life lived on the edge? Or did something far darker unfold in those final hours? With conflicting evidence, unreliable witnesses, and unanswered questions, the truth may forever remain just out of reach. What we do know is this: Johnny Thunders died at 38, but he lived with a ferocity few ever dare. He helped shape punk rock, inspired generations of musicians, and burned through life with raw honesty and uncompromising passion. His death may be shrouded in mystery, but his music tells a story that refuses to fade. And here's what still haunts investigators and fans alike: details from that night that never quite added up. Pieces of the story that were ignored, dismissed, or quietly forgotten. If you want to explore those hidden details, untold theories, and the full investigation behind Johnny Thunders' final hours, download the Skoob app now to get access to the complete story. Dive deeper, question everything, and decide for yourself what really happened in room 37.